Hello everybody, welcome. Wish I could see you, all of you. There aren't very many of you who watch my videos, though I suppose a number of machines could be said to process my videos, but they could not be said to observe them. It's been a little while since I've made a video, and there's a number of things on my mind, some more troubling than others. We're in the second winter moon cycle as of 2 nights ago, when it was the new moon. I remember the name of the first winter moon in Blackfoot, but the second one is quite a tongue twister for those of us unfamiliar with speaking Blackfoot. The first winter moon is called Itotstoi, I think. This moon is, I think the translation is something like when the waters freeze over. This is when life becomes very hard for animals and human beings that live outside. The bitter cold makes it very difficult to find food, and shelter becomes very important for those of us who don't have built-in protections from the cold. But even for those beings who do, it's a time of hardship and struggle. It's also a time of wonder. Transformation. Many aspects of the living places go to sleep or enter into a kind of senescence in the fall, what we call the fall, probably named after the falling leaves, because the way that temperatures fall is more or less metaphoric. But other things come to life and preserve, act as bridges in a way across the winter trials. I haven't traveled much in my life, but I once traveled to Boston, where I was undergoing training in how to operate, clean, and repair a very peculiar and advanced imaging device called an iris that used radio waves to create stochastic patterns in the inks that jet from its inkwells onto the paper after being sent an electronic image of some specific resolution. Anyway, it was the first time I'd been in my adult life where I had traveled outside of California at all. And it was very cold. I had nearly never seen the snow and had only very briefly been in snow in my lifetime. But when I went to Boston that year, I was probably 27 or 28. Went with my best friend Miles. It was very surprisingly cold, and I didn't find it disturbing. I went out in it. Though I was pretty bundled up, I was wearing layers, and of course I was young and stuff too. It's relatively easy to stay warm. I think with wind chill, it was like 12 below or something like this, at least once. And I enjoyed it. It was very different from my common experience. The reason I mention it is that well, I ended up in North End in Boston, which is an Italian neighborhood that vaguely resembles North Beach here in San Francisco, except that in North End, the Italians were incredibly friendly to me, and more so once they realized that I myself was Italian. And they showed me quite a good time. Took me to their restaurants, fixed me up with a date. Lots of beautiful things happened there in the short time that I was visiting that place. But I guess what I noticed was that it seemed to me anyway that perhaps part of why people were more friendly there was because it was so very cold. And therefore, you know, where it's cold, you have to depend on each other. Right? You have to depend on each other in all kinds of ways. Otherwise, people die. And of course, people die even when we do depend on each other, too. But it was just an atmosphere of much deeper kindness and sort of mutual humanity there than I was used to around here. And particularly, I have to say, I've never found North Beach in San Francisco very friendly. My experiences there with other Italians have mostly been commercial experiences, right? I'm going to a restaurant or a cafe or something like this. And they've never been particularly friendly. I would describe the general atmosphere in North Beach as relatively aloof.
This one says do not enter.
And, you know, it could just be that in the times that I was in North Beach, I haven't been there in a long time, much, though I used to go there regularly. I used to work in that area a lot. Who knows what the variables are that contribute to that. But my point is, in the cold winter times where it gets really cold, our lives, they more depend on our relationships than they ordinarily would. And of course, people who are particularly wealthy or well off can afford to live in seclusion or isolation or aloofness. And that may be part of why the Italians in North Beach seem much less friendly than those I met in North End. In a startling coincidence, one day I ran into a girl at the grocery store who looked incredibly familiar. Couldn't place where I knew her from. And I approached her and I said, "You look familiar to me. Are you from my hometown? You know, did we go to school together or something?" She said, No. You look familiar to me too." And then I realized eventually that this was the girl that I'd had a couple of dates with when I was in North End. And I went back and said, do you remember? She's like, "Oh yes, of course." So she moved from the place in North End where we met to the neighborhood in which I live in San Francisco. It's a funny coincidence, don't you think? The politics of coincidence, by which we mean not not really the politics, because it's not actually politic, unless I misunderstand the nature of the word, which is possible. The peculiar harmonies, synchronies, dissonance and assonance within the web of what we perceive as coincidental, occurring together, situationally. I had last week a couple of strange coincidences, but it's not really my intention to speak at length of them right now. I have to say, though, I far prefer places where it's common or traditional for people to treat each other with kindness, respect, concern, awareness, care, love, creativity, play, joy, celebration. And this has become, in the time of the pandemic, both far less common in some ways and much more common in others, because the sudden impoverishments that nearly all of us have experienced, of course, some of us were already living lifestyles that were somewhat isolated before the pandemic, so those people are not quite as affected, though they must be affected if they have relationships with other people. And the impoverishment of even casual connection with other human beings in public and such, and the strange and yet somehow protective situation with wearing masks. The division of the population into the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. The profusion of psyops, cultural warfare, propaganda by actors both, native to our country and, or how shall I put it? It's not the right word. Actors from home and afar, right, who have dangerous agendas. In other words, they want to hurt people. They want people to die and get sick and become scared and confused and become even more distrustful of authority and institutions. And so that's a pretty easy game to play. Our society is so fucked up that in 12, 50 different ways I could name, that it's really easy to puppeteer from outside or within, and to create divisions, misinformation, disinformation, to produce cults of opinion. In some ways, we're reliving certain aspects of history that resemble the onset of really different kinds of social situations, some of them including fascism and racism and culturist cults and cohorts, but also those that at the same time producing cohorts with an unusual capacity for deep perspective and for learning and for understanding and for teaching other people and for growing, for coming back together, for bonding, for working with each other for each other. So it's a time of both of these things, but the dark side is easier to see. It's also much more troubling. It's not imperative that we concern ourselves with the good things, that are happening, because mostly they take care of themselves, right? They don't need a lot of attention from us. But the aspects of our minds and our awareness and the social cohorts that we form are extremely vulnerable to having what the organ that I'll refer to as our threat sentinel awakened, inflamed, fed. That's an incredibly dangerous little organ. That's one of the things that is the seed imperatives of many of our darkest shadows in thought and culture, opinion and ideology come from inflation of the threat sentinel. So bad actors who want to sow division, mistrust and death, all they really have to do is kind of keep poking that thing in various ways, and they'll get a lot of mileage out of that. So this morning I got a text from one of my friends, and he just very simply asked me, what are your thoughts on the vaccine? And I realized I was going to probably have to make a video about that. And of course, this won't be the first time I've discussed the topic. And I have a lot of different things to say. I'm trying to organize them in my mind, but I'm going to start with a very simple fact. And I don't want this fact to overstand the nuances in the rest of my concerns and discussion. But the simple fact is, our modern institutions are lethal garbage. They are fucked. Not only can we not trust them, they are formed and sustained for purposes that generally, ironically, oppose whatever positive goals they may acquire their mandates from in general. This doesn't mean that they're only fucked and only lethal. That's not true, right? That's too absolute. But generally speaking, the motives of profit, domination, conversion of populations to patients and consumers and party members and so on, those motives are fundamentally toxic. And now that it's 2021, the distant future of my childhood, it's long past time that we do away completely with those motivations, ideas, and even the possibility of that happening on Earth, on our world, because it's ripping our planet and our lives and our future to shreds on purpose all day, every day. So I'm going to start there. Our institutions are fucked. And with very few exceptions, they're untrustworthy because their primary imperatives have to do with profit. Medicine should have nothing to do with profiteering. Science should have nothing to do with profiteering. Once these ways of knowing become infected with the necessity of making a profit, it's impossible to trust them anymore. That doesn't mean that we can dismiss the findings of science, or that our medical knowledge is all wrong or just lies. It means that we're in a very complex situation where we have to learn together to make sense out of the data, information, disinformation, misinformation, opinion, declarations, and so on that are swarming about us in the electronic, social, political, and religious spheres of, well, those milieus, right? And those milieus are aspects of what I refer to as the human cognition, a subset of the cognitia on Earth, a subset of the cognitia in the universe. And that word's just a way of saying network of minds. So, I'm very concerned because our institutions have become hopelessly corrupt. And that must lead to disaster. There's no way around it. Thankfully, they're not only corrupt, and there's enough authentic altruism left in the human beings inside the institutions that occasionally amazing or important things get done, even beautiful things. There's a specific, what was the other? I had another. The first problem was with the institutions. Information. There's a problem when it benefits. See, the problem is the idea of enemies. This is an idea that's too expensive to sustain anymore. And there's a problem when there are enemy cohorts that benefit from manipulating public opinion. Because now it's in our time, due to the rapid emergence of electronic communications technologies, or the rapid transformation of those technologies in the past 20 years, it's now possible to directly manipulate whole societies, and to create divisive cohorts inside them, and to puppeteer those cohorts with great technical skill and effect. And that's a terrifying problem that we need to learn how to do the opposite of. And that's something that we're capable of doing. We've been capable of it for some time, actually. No one has made the proper advances toward the discovery and enaction of the protocols that would allow us to kind of have the opposite thing going on. I have some ideas about that, but I'm unlikely to pursue them on my own because they're systemic size ideas, right? They're ways of changing the whole way that we relate with electronic machines and information. The gaps, getting across the gaps in winter. The vaccine. So, coyotes. Gap crossers. So, in a way, the pandemic is a kind of long winter. Right? It's the epidemiological version of something like a nuclear winter, where we have a winter that lasts through many seasons. Because everything becomes more difficult for everyone. Lots of people die. New technologies and mandates and imperatives emerge in our social cultures, our political cultures. The institutions transform in accordance with, the variation that the threat introduces. And it wakes up the threat sentinels of everybody. Now, on the one hand, one might say, what an astonishing miracle that we're able to produce, distribute, and administer a vaccine in an incredibly short period of time to hundreds of millions of people. Of course, not exactly one vaccine, a number of vaccines. Some of them based on the same principle, which is getting our cells to produce a mimic of the spike protein ACE2, by which the coronavirus attaches to our cells, so that our immune system recognizes that protein and produces antigens against it. Antigens that essentially protect us from having an overreaction of our immune system, which is mostly what kills human beings from Covid-19, in so much as I understand the information that I've come across and that's been transmitted to me by experts primarily. So the RNA vaccine, for a very short period of time, the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines utilize lipid nanoparticles to distribute, well, first of all, to protect the very delicate RNA that is taken up into our cells, and briefly, according to what I've understood, causes our cells to produce a mimic of the spike protein. That alerts our immune system to the structure of the spike protein, so that it will recognize it quickly in the future, rapidly mount a response that keeps it from overreacting. And there's a lot of people who make noises about, well, as long as you have a strong immune system, you're fine. Those people know nothing about immune systems. Saying that you have a strong immune system is like saying you have a strong nuclear arsenal, right? And just remember that before we used our nuclear arsenal on Japan, we first used it on ourselves to terrifying effect. Millions of people, Americans, have died, probably as a result of the tests that we conducted in the Nevada desert and the resulting fallout, cancer, and other toxicities that were produced during those tests. A strong immune system is weird language for anyone who understands immunology. They might understand the difference between a damaged or weakened immune system and a healthy immune system, but a strong immune system is a dangerous thing. And in fact, mostly what kills people from COVID isn't COVID. It's our own immune system overreacting to the intrusion of a pathogen. And it seems to be that it's primarily the overreaction of our immune systems that causes most of the lethal effects of being infected by this virus. So people who run around going like, just make sure you have a strong immune system, those people have no idea what they're fucking talking about. A strong immune system will kill you when you get COVID. Won't protect you, right? A healthy immune system doesn't over-respond to threats. That's a different kind of thing. And you can't generate a healthy immune system. Each person is immunologically incredibly unique. They bear likenesses to other human beings. In other words, there are general trends and things we can find in all the humans and so on. But there are many things that are very unique about each human being because their immunological history is unique to their own body, and also partly to their line, their family, and so on. So concepts mislead us into thinking that two apples are the same thing. They are the same member, they are the same sub-member of a category of things, right? Two knives are both knives. But if you looked at their actual physical uniqueness, even if they were the same knife by the same manufacturer, each one would be infinitely unique. In other words, you could never exhaust finding new unique things about both of those knives that are supposedly the same thing and are just metal objects, right? I'm talking like butter knives, right? Nothing exotic. So although our language and conceptual ideas in our lexicons lead us to believe the two things that are called the same thing are the same thing, they are not the same thing. And whatever it is that we're calling them, they are not that either, because they are not tags, and what we are calling them are tags. So this is important to understand in a very deep way if you want to preserve any hope of something resembling intelligence as a human being. You have to get the difference between the tags and the infinite novelty that they refer to, even though it is also true that there are useful similarities among things that are tagged the same way. So back to the vaccine. On the one hand, it's miraculous that we live in a time with the technology to rapidly produce, distribute, and administer a vaccine that appears effective against a fairly lethal, even though the percentages don't seem very high, of death or permanent disability. It doesn't take a very high percentage when you're talking about 300 million people to produce a catastrophe. So if there are 340 million people in the United States and, 10 or 15 million of them die over a period of a few months of a disease that can keep on killing people who are unvaccinated, you have a serious problem. And there are other infrastructural problems, like if it wipes out your doctors and nurses, you're screwed because you can't reproduce them during a pandemic when people can't be in classrooms together. And it takes, although you can get a degree in medicine in maybe 5 to 7 years, it often takes 30 or 40 years to produce a human expert capable of advanced medical practice, right? Like the person who operated on the pancreas of someone close to me. Operating on a pancreas is like trying to operate on a little chunk of wet toilet paper. If you touch it, it falls apart. It's that delicate. So the idea that you could even operate on a pancreas at all is kind of absurd. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's not impossible, but it's really, really difficult and fraught with peril. To produce someone capable of performing an operation like that takes many, many years of practice and great specialization, great passion, and so on. So if you wipe out the medical infrastructure, now you're going to not just have people dying of COVID. You don't even have to wipe it out. All you have to do is impact it significantly. And you're going to have people dying of broken bones. You're going to have people dying of sepsis, of diseases that are easily treatable. So there's a serious threat to the medical infrastructure. And in our highly populated, city-dwelling, advanced, quote-unquote, that's a hilarious idea. Actually, our nations and societies are extremely primitive. The ways in which they're advanced are mostly versions of lethal disease, but they are highly organized, right? Funny word, organized. So it's a miracle that we can produce and distribute this vaccine. The pandemic is real. It's relatively unlikely that it came from a lab. However, nature is a bit lab-like, and the human activity in nature that's wiping out the anciently conserved ecologies will continue to present us with staggering, unexpected situations involving pathogens, disease, and other features of deadly ignorance for the foreseeable future. So we can expect that process to keep going, right, and keep producing new candidates for, disastrous outcomes. Not too likely it came from a lab. There are labs, and even here in San Francisco, for reasons that are completely beyond my understanding, and something that I find infuriating, is that UCSF was the hospital right around my house that I can probably show you a picture of in a minute, was working with strains of the COVID-19 virus and literally doing gain of function research right around the corner from my house on this particular, pathogen. How that happened, why that happened, who authorized that, these are questions that we should get answered, and this is the kind of thing that should be prosecuted. That's insane. So it's a miracle, technologically, medically, that we're able to produce a vaccine that demonstrates efficacy and appears at least superficially safe to use. There's all kinds of swarming constellations of conspiracy theory around this situation. That's very troubling. That's evidence that the threat sentinels in our minds and societies have become inflamed. As far as the safety of the vaccine, we should be shown science, right? If people are making the claim that something is science, then they need to give us the data. And what I mean by the data are the p-values for various aspects of safety and threat associated with vaccines in general, these vaccines in particular, the components of these particular vaccines. We need to know everything. And that's not going on. What's going on is something kind of weird that looks a lot more like politics than it does science. It's not that there's no science going on. There's plenty of science going on. However, we're not being given the full story. We're not being shown all the data. And there's a variety of different reasons why that's happening. So, that large structure up there by the branch of the tree, that's part of UCSF. The orange buildings, the yellow buildings, the strange futuristic building. In ordinary science, what happens is statistical analysis is done to produce something like confidence intervals. And these give us an idea both of how confident we are about some causal agent, some effect, some medication, and its effect on the body, effect on the medical condition, and so on. We're given these things called confidence intervals, and there's another feature called p-values that help us to understand the probabilistic likelihood of various claims, assertions, models, theories, and things like safety and toxicity, right? And we're not really seeing all the data on the vaccines. That data doesn't exist. Ordinarily what happens is medications are tested first. There's all kinds of things that go on. There's computerized simulations, there's testing in animal models. The animal model testing has some drawbacks. It's not perfect. Often the animal model is mice, because we're not allowed to do testing on primates. It's probably good, although it also creates problems. And then eventually medications go into human trials. This process is very complicated. The process can be manipulated, and we don't get perfect data, right? Because one thing we don't do, for example, is administer a medication to, say, 10,000 people. And then, like we do with mice, kill those people and perform extremely detailed autopsies, and then kill a bunch of healthy people and do the same autopsies and look for differences between the unaffected cohort, right, the unmedicated cohort and the medicated cohort. So we don't actually know a lot, as much as we should, about the effects of medications on human beings, and this is a source of iatrogenic harm. That just means harm caused by medical procedures. In my view, the safety data on the vaccines is wildly incomplete. And we hear ridiculous statements like, well, what about the 300 million people that we've already administered it to? And my response to that is, have you killed those people and done autopsies on them? Have you examined their cells, their organelles, their mitochondria? Do you have any idea what the effects of the vaccines were other than producing immunity? In other words, what are the non-desired effects of vaccination, right? We need to know about that. And before someone can make a kind of universal generalization like the vaccines have proven to be safe and effective, we need all the data. And if we're not being provided with that data, then those statements are lying, straight up lying, right? Now, I get that there's a political problem. There's a pandemic. We need to get people vaccinated to stop the collapse of our supply chains, medical infrastructure, educational infrastructure, and so on. One moment. So there's an emergency. And in an emergency, you have to take some risks. That's okay. We all understand that. If my house is on fire, I'd have to take risks just to get out of my house. But we shouldn't be told that we're not taking risks. We shouldn't be told, no, of course, the vaccines are safe. Because, first of all, that can't be true. There's not enough data. And what's actually going on is that pharmaceutical companies are conducting perhaps the largest single human medical experiment in all of history. That's what's going on. It's not necessarily true that they're making billions of dollars off of the experiment. The experiment is somewhat costly in some ways. But they are getting data. And another weird problem that's been going on is that we're hearing things like, well, there's no evidence that thus and such causes this and that. But there's also, when the claim of there's a lack of evidence is exactly the same claim you'd get when no exploration has been done or no data has been provided, right? So there's no evidence that radiation causes cancer until you do the research to look and see that indeed radiation causes cancer. And many other forms of disease. It destroys the DNA in our cells, damages it, knocks out chunks of it. So, on the one hand, we have claims that the vaccine is safe. On the other hand, we do have a vast vaccinated population. Most of them aren't dying of the vaccine. Some of them do. It's a very small percentage, but some of them do. Some people have bad reactions. Some people get the vaccine injected accidentally into a vein or capillary. I think this is called aspiration, but I'm not sure. And that results in the vaccine circulating in the bloodstream in a way that it's not supposed to do. And that can result in various kinds of disaster for people's health, but it doesn't always do that. At least not immediately. personally, I haven't seen enough data about the safety of the vehicle, let alone the process of getting cells to produce this ACE2 mimic protein, spike protein. That protein is involved in lots of other, it seems to me, in lots of other metabolic pathways. So there should be at least some degree of concern about whether or not getting our cells to produce this protein for a short period of time in order to instruct our immune system about it, what are the risks associated with that? We need to know the data. We don't need to be told, we haven't found any problems with it yet. That's not data. That's not science, right? Again, you can make the same statement about fucking Fallout, right? We haven't found any problems with Fallout yet. Well, if you don't look, then you don't find, and then there's nothing to report. So it has to be examined very closely, these matters, and it's not being examined closely enough, in my view. Not for an experiment on hundreds of millions of people that could affect the future of mankind. And of course, we have science fiction stories where a single medical event produces a medication that's widely distributed that changes our genes for the rest, for the foreseeable future, or damages our capacity to reproduce. I think the film Children of Men might have been about this. I might have the title wrong. So, there are significant risks when you're administering a relatively untested medical procedure to millions of people. On the bright side, so far it looks pretty good. Could there possibly be long-term future effects of having been vaccinated in this time? Yes, there could be. What's the likelihood? Well, we need data to estimate that likelihood. Most of that data isn't available, but we can make rough estimates, and most of them are fairly low. There's no reason to out of the gate presume that these vaccine technologies are likely to produce long-term health effects that are noticeable. They certainly change some things in our body, but from what we understand, the circulation period is mostly pretty small, right? It's, 72 hours or something like this. So there's a very significant short-term effect, and that involves activating our immune systems and getting them to, to prototype the antigens, and then, store those antigens in the library in case we are exposed to something that produces the ACE2 protein, the spike protein, the attachment protein. There are other vaccination methods. Not all of them involve lipid nanoparticles. But one of the things I find concerning is that there doesn't seem to be much safety data on the specific recipes for lipid nanoparticles that were used in these vaccines. And if there's no data, then no one can tell us they're safe and be telling the truth. What they might be able to say truthfully is that from everything we can understand, being vaccinated, while it does pose some small degree of risk, asterisk by that word small, is vastly less risky than getting COVID. And if you get COVID and you are vaccinated, statistically, your chances for survival and for the minimization of long-term health effects are much better. That data seems to be fairly robust, unlikely to have been muchly doctored. The confidence intervals and p-values on that data, mostly available, probably not doctored. Or if so, not doctored enough to change the expected outcomes, right? So these are some of my concerns, but there's another interesting thing going on, which is we have this thing called the VAERS database. And the VAERS database is an unusual thing. because most of the data that we get about medical procedures and their efficacy, about medications and their efficacy and the dangers in using them and the side effects and so on, almost all that data comes directly from medical professionals only, right? So doctors, nurses, surgeons, other healthcare professionals report on side effects, and testing's done on large human cohorts to determine what the side effects are. Side effects being unwanted effects, undesirable effects, or effects that we don't know what's causing them when a medication or medical procedure is performed. Medication is taken, medical procedure performed. So most of the reporting is done by medical professionals, and it's certainly insufficient reporting. Who knows what percentage of events it actually captures? Maybe something like 15 to 20% of events are captured in some way. Probably less. Probably something like 7. But since you have millions of people, 7% gives you some kind of a data, window to work with. The VAERS database is different. It allows anyone to report effects for any reason at all. And there really hasn't, in my memory, there's never been anything quite like this. Yes, you can search the VAERS database. It's relatively difficult to use. There's lots of doubled results, so that, for example, in doing a search for a particular kind of outcome, I would find up to 7 or even 12 of the same report enumerated in the results. So let's say there were 10,000 results. I think that's the limitation of a search query. And I'm looking at the first page and I can see, there's 7 duplicated results in that first page, meaning the same report is counted 7 times. That's a problem in a database. There are certainly people who have died from being vaccinated. That almost always happens. Most medical procedures have some risk. Vaccination has mostly a pretty modest risk if you run the numbers for all the different vaccines. Pretty low risk, generally speaking. But some people died. So the risk was not low for them. And there's no statistical model to determine which of those, what's going to happen to me if I get a vaccine. There's no way to tell that. And so many people feel naturally cautious or skeptical about being vaccinated. And other people have become very concerned that rights are going to be tied to medical procedures and that there's no end in sight to this. Booster after booster, more and more rights and privileges being tied to the necessity of having a medical procedure. This is a slippery and dangerous slope that many people are reasonably very concerned about, or angry about, or terrified of. Again, if our institutions are crap and most of our authorities are shills, why should we trust what we're being told, especially if our life may depend on it? Now, of course, there's all kinds of trivial things that we trust implicitly. We go to the store and buy canned food, right? We go to the store and, we do all kinds of crazy things. We smoke cigarettes, we use gasoline in cars, we do things that are insane all the time, right? Without the slightest bit of concern over, will we be killed or whatever. And we do these things primarily to acquire privileges and conveniences. So it's important to bear in mind that when we begin to call out one thing, like the vaccination thing, we should include the blatantly insane things that we do all the time without a second thought and with no concern about the repercussions, and with no upsurge of entitled, opinionated outrage, right? Pretty much everyone knows that the kinds of plastics used to line the cans in which we buy canned food are toxic, produce cancer, birth defects, and fuck up our hormones. Does that stop us from canning food or eating canned food? Well, some of us don't, but the vast majority of people eat canned food anyway, right? They don't go marching in the street by the thousands protesting, polyvinyl chlorates or whatever the fuck they are. They don't flip out. Their threat sentinel doesn't become too inflamed. Although some do. And sometimes there are protests about things like that. But the scope of the weirdness in the current situation is enormous. It's gigantic. And I'm not saying it's unjustified, but it's confusing. If we look at the whole picture, if we look at the broad spectrum of things that we have to make decisions about, and which ones of them are likely to pose lethal dangers to our health or well-being, most of the features of our modern life fall into that category, right? So why aren't we flipping out and going apeshit crazy about those things and running off to other countries that have no mandates and things like this? I mean, if we're going to go batshit crazy, why is it this particular thing we're going batshit crazy about? And again, it may turn out in the future that we made a terrible mistake with the vaccines. It's not very likely, but it's conceivable. I think I've probably asserted my vaccination status in previous videos, but I won't do so here. Because really what I'm trying to explore is what I'm thinking. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the VAERS database because it's kind of scary. And the first time I looked at it, I was pretty frightened. There are some people out there who are quite intelligent. Brett Weinstein is one of them, and his wife, whose name I cannot recall at the moment, is another one. They're very concerned about the vaccines, and they're very intelligent evolutionary biologists. They've done podcasts on the topic, most of which have been removed because these days we're having a problem with something resembling literally psyops warfare, and it's very difficult for the institutions like YouTube and Facebook and so on to tell the difference between reasonable scientific inquiry and blatant disinformation. And because Brett Weinstein has chosen to remain unvaccinated and to use the antiparasitic drug ivermectin prophylactically, meaning him and his wife are taking ivermectin, I don't know, daily or something, as a prophylactic against getting COVID-19, which, let's face it, there's no significant evidence for that I can understand. But because they're doing that, they are seen as part of the problem with misinformation. I think we should be able to have the discussions we want to have, and that we should develop technologies that allow us to tell the difference between disinformation, misinformation, and necessary discussion, because we can easily do that. That's a doable thing. And in fact, I've modeled a system to do this that I call a Verity Sentinel that we could use for all kinds of electronic information, including videos and texts and so on. In any case, back to the VAERS system. So the first time I looked at VAERS, I was pretty nervous. And I realized that the data is not being reported by medical professionals. This is a self-reporting system, right? Anyone can report, number one. Number two, actually I'm going to back up for just a second here and explain something. In a pandemic, bad actors have an investment in getting people to not be vaccinated. You can drop a bomb on a city and kill up a bunch of people. But in a pandemic, all you need to do to kill up a bunch of people in a city is ensure that there's enough vaccine skepticism and skepticism about the disease itself to get people to act recklessly. And if you do that, you can kill up a lot of people without really having used any weapon other than words or, ideas. So that's a really cheap way to kill people. The pandemic is real. The virus is real. It kills people. It doesn't kill everybody. Some people are asymptomatic. But when you have large populations of human beings in various states of health crammed together in cities, a pandemic is a very serious threat to public health, to human health, and longevity. So there's a real threat, in my view. And there are a variety of secondary and tertiary threats associated with this. Like I said, you don't have to kill off all our doctors and nurses to fuck up our medical systems. Currently, when attempting to get appointments for medical evaluation and such, many of us are having to wait up to 3 to 6 to 8 to 12 to 15 months. It's 2021. We can get 1 million videos directly piped to our homes, but we can't get medical procedures taken care of. And there are other aspects of our society that are suffering similarly. This is primarily due both to the pandemic and our peculiar failure to prepare for something like this. All that money was spent elsewhere or gobbled up by parasites. We don't have the infrastructure in place to deal with this kind of event, so we had to cobble it together very quickly. And the VAERS database is part of that cobbling. Researchers, doctors, and scientists are reasonably skeptical about the VAERS database because anyone can report anything. And it's very difficult to determine, in many cases, whether or not vaccination had anything to do with the medical outcome that is reported in the VAERS database. So this is why it is said there's no evidence that there's no causal evidence that links the vaccines to the events reported in the VAERS database. Now, that's only partly true, but it's reasonably true. There's another kind of weird thing about the database that didn't occur to me until long after my initial concerns. It is this. Let's take the United States as a sample size. Now let's presume, just for kicks, that we vaccinate everyone in the United States. Which means all the children, all the elderly people, everyone, right? And I don't know exactly how many people that is. I'm going to make a wild guess that it's about 340 million. And what I do know from looking up the data is that each day, 7,124 people die. No matter what you do, if you do nothing at all, every day, 7,124 people die. So, if only half of those are from medical causes, right? Various medical causes. Heart failure, cancer, repercussions of diabetes, leukemia, pneumonia, the flu, whatever. Sepsis, an infection, a hemorrhage, an aneurysm, whatever. If only half of those are medical, then you still got about 3,050 people per day. It's about 30,500 people every 10 days. That's about 90,000 people every 30 days. So if you do nothing at all, and you just track who dies, I mean, you just build a database and let people report who died, right? You're going to get 30,500 dead people a day in the database, right? So after 10 days, you're going to have 300,000 dead people. And some of them will die of Bell's palsy, some of them will die of, Alzheimer's, some of them, they'll die of all different kinds of things. So if you vaccinate everybody and then you build a database, naturally a certain number of people are going to die within a week of being vaccinated, or a month of being vaccinated, or 6 months of being vaccinated. Does that mean, how would we tell whether or not there was a causal link? Well, forensic autopsies are one way to tell. We can look very carefully at the organs, at the cells. We can do all kinds of assays to make a determination about whether or not something unusual took place here. But most of that's not being done. So the problem with the VAERS database is a real problem with data. And the problem can be simply stated in a number of different ways. One of them is, how do we tell that a death or a undesirable medical outcome that is recorded in the VAERS database has any relationship to being vaccinated? How do we tell? It's hard to tell. That doesn't mean we can say, well, actually we can reasonably say, well, there's no evidence. Because if we don't do the research, there's obviously no evidence. But we also have to bear in mind, rather than just being wildly suspicious, that, again, 90,000 people die every month in different age ranges. Now, if there's a sudden uptick in younger age ranges or something like this, that's interesting, and we should look carefully at that. It's not clear to me. There's a whole bunch of interest and activity organized around getting common people to believe that vaccination is truly safe. There isn't an appropriate amount of activity and research being done to validate that claim. That's the problem I'm having. But as far as the VAERS database goes, not only is it not clear that the vaccine is the causal factor in, say, more than 20% of the reported situations in VAERS, if you just run the numbers about, ordinary people like dying, the numbers in VAERS are not only not surprising, they're probably modest, right? Very modest in compared to what we might expect if we just set up a database and said, if something goes wrong with one of your family members, please report it here, right? So that's a complex problem. That's a weird situation. In terms of the wild theories about the government trying to manipulate the human biome or the genome with the vaccines, those are mostly the sign of an overactive threat sentinel, but we're all aware that bad things have happened in the past. Governments have tested weapons on citizens of their own nations, ours included, bioweapons and so on. There's black projects and things like this that we don't find out about until 50 years later, when it's suddenly revealed that some horrifying thing was done to some segment of the population to test some theory or weapon or medication. And we live in a time where life is more like science fiction than it's ever been. So I have compassion for the people who are concerned about these things, though I think them mostly to be profoundly unlikely. Not impossible, but so unlikely as to be wildly improbable at best. Also, if there was something going on, and there may well be something going on, it doesn't require a vaccine to pull it off. You can do it with nothing other than electronic information. And nobody's freaking out about that, at least not enough. So you don't need to put a needle in people's arms to wildly sort of affect their life, health, mind, activity, behavior, thoughts, opinions, allegiances, and so on. That's easily done in much simpler ways. And it just seems wildly unlikely to me that that's anything like what's happening in the current situation. Again, it's not impossible, it's just extremely, extremely unlikely. But because our institutions suck and are broken and fucked up and maladaptive, and some of them are malignant, it's not surprising that people would have this idea, or that they would attach it specifically to a medical procedure that is extremely widespread in its adoption. There's so much more to say about the topic. I've covered only a few of my concerns and perspectives here. I have feelings on all sides of the argument. I share the concerns of people who feel skeptical and worried about the situation and about being forced to have a medical procedure. I also share the rational perspectives and ideas on the side on the sides, because there are many sides to these issues, not two, of people who just clearly decided to be vaccinated. And most of those people are not merely trying to protect themselves, they're trying to protect other people. So, in so much as we can understand it, it's an altruistic act that we undertake to protect ourselves and each other from being killed or seriously having our health seriously compromised by complications from COVID-19. Again, a very complex topic. I have perspectives all around the thing. I don't have just a single perspective. And I'm fully capable of considering strange science fiction scenarios. I just don't tend to promote them to high likelihood. Right? But one thing's clear. It resembles a long winter. And so the wise move is to take care of one another and form deep relationships and rely upon each other, learn to rely upon each other for care and kindness, awareness, intelligence, attention, learning together about what's going on rather than deciding that we know already. Though there are some features of the situation that seem relatively obvious or blatant. So let us carry on together, helping each other learn and grow and survive, and hopefully transform our societies and institutions in ways that would allow us to feel confident about their intelligence and decision-making processes and the outcomes of those processes. I'm glad to still be alive, actually. The world has changed very radically, very suddenly. I expect that process to continue and expand in the near-term future. But for now, I'm still free. I can walk around under the beautiful sky in the beautiful living world and talk with you joyfully and hopefully about the astonishing wonders of our human experience and existence. May you be safe and well. May you be happy, creative, playful, and hopeful.